Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, January 11th, 2019. I hope I've been getting the date right the last couple of days. I think I have. The year isn't in front of me, and I've been making an effort to say 2019. And as I'm saying it, I was saying to myself, I wonder if I've been saying 2018 once or twice. I know I remember making the effort to say 2019. If I said it, I meant 2019. And obviously, when I said during previous shows that it was 2018, I didn't mean it was actually 2018. So, of course, reference here to Trump backing out yesterday of all of his campaign pledges that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. Very interesting to see that one happen. I don't know exactly why that one occurred to me. I didn't even bother putting that one aside at this point. But, somewhere out there is the quote, and I guess maybe we'll grab it and I'll prove it to you if you can't believe it. I mean, it is possible that you wouldn't be able to even believe he would say such a thing. But he's finally come around to saying it's true. When I said during the campaign that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, I didn't mean they were going to write a check or anything like that. Of course, it was pretty quickly disproven that his excuse anyway. I guess people came up with old copies, since deleted, I guess, from his campaign website, and it laid out pretty clearly and in no uncertain terms that he expected a one-time payment, as he put it, of somewhere between $5 and $10 billion from Mexico. I don't really know how that would have happened, but for sending a check, but there it is. Let me see. I can grab this one here. CNN had a report on it. Betsy Klein did it. Trump claims, obviously, Mexico isn't going to write a check for a border wall. Well, that's certainly true. The problem is that it wasn't something that he claimed during the campaign. We all know what happened then. But on Thursday, yesterday, he says, it says Thursday, Trump said that his oft-made 2016 campaign promise that he would build a wall and Mexico would pay for it didn't mean it would be a direct payment, despite outlining just that scenario during his campaign. When, during the campaign, I would say Mexico is going to pay for it, obviously, I never said this. I never meant they're going to write out a check. I said they're going to pay for it. They are, he said as he prepared to depart the White House for the southern border. But in April of 2016, do you really need the proof of this? Trump's campaign outlined the steps he would take to compel Mexico to pay the U.S. $5 to $10 billion to fund a border wall, which is, of course, A, nowhere near what it's going to take to build a complete border wall, and B, did I say one? A, B. I think I'm on A, B. B was curiously almost exactly what he was forcing United States taxpayers to pay in order to reopen the federal government. $5 billion is the mark. I can't believe that he's actually transferring that directly from Mexico to us and is so shameless to do it in front of everybody. But, I say I can't believe it, but it's just a figure of speech. Of course I can believe it. Well, there you have it. So on the old website, it said it's an easy decision for Mexico. Make a one-time payment of $5 to $10 billion to ensure that $24 billion, pardon me, continues to flow into their country year after year, the memo said. What's he talking about, the $24 billion? I don't know. That might, for all I know, be the trade deficit that he thinks we run with Mexico. I don't think we do, but who knows? Maybe, possibly. I don't keep up to date on that. This is one of the more useless figures in the world, trade deficits as between the United States and neighbors in particular. But anyway, yes. So now, using a broad interpretation of the post 9/11 USA Patriot Act, Trump wrote in the memo, yeah, right, he wrote it, sure, that he would threaten to issue new regulations that would compel money transfer companies like Western Union to verify a client's identity and legal status before authorizing a wire transfer. Trump now claims his renegotiated trade deal with Mexico and Canada would result in Mexico indirectly paying for the wall. But, of course, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal has not yet been approved by Congress, and even the perceived benefits of its passage would not amount to a Mexican direct or indirect payment for the border wall. Whatever economic benefits the trade deal delivers would be reflected in financial benefits to companies and higher wages for some individuals, not in any immediate financial boon to the U.S. government. Interesting. My mind now flashing back to yesterday's reading of the New Yorker article about how Jake Tapper had become confused, let's say, by the folks at the Mercatus Center in how to analyze Medicare for All proposals. And you recall that the heart of that confusion was that Bernie Sanders, in this case, had said that the American people would save $2 trillion by moving to Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, and he said that essentially that was false because the government would be spending much more on Medicare for all, not saving $2 trillion. But then the claim was never that the United States government was going to save the money, but that United States citizens would save that money in the form of lower health care costs. And, how could I separate the people of the United States from the government of the United States? Well, looks like it was, I guess the same mistake, let's say, is being made here by Donald Trump. Very interesting. Anyway, you don't really need to know too much more about the wall and Donald Trump's failure to build it and his failure to get Mexico to pay for it. Just all you really need to know is that he's actually running around the country telling people he never really said that Mexico was going to pay for it. Although he did make the crowd often say it. Maybe that's why he did that. I didn't say Mexico was going to pay for it. You did. Anyway, something else I promised you yesterday and didn't get to is I told you that my new favorite thing on Twitter was slowing down Trump speeches by half, playing them at, I guess, half speed, so that he sounds like a drunken idiot slurring his speech. And it's very funny. And I thought I could possibly cue that thing up for you and play it. It's kind of a jump in context, but I just wanted to make sure you got to hear this so you could agree that it's possibly the funniest thing you could ever do with hearing Donald Trump speak. I happened to catch this from the tweet of Steve Marmel. How do you say, Steve? Who tweeted this one around, having picked it up from Arlen Parsa. And Steve says, slowing Trump down by half so he sounds like a day-drinking racist jerk in a dive bar is the most brilliant way to dissect him. Kudos to Alan Parsa for that. And let me see, if I crank up my volume here and then hit the refresh button.
I'll be honest. I think it was a great victory. And actually, some of the news this morning was that it was, in fact, a great victory. But if you look at it from the standpoint of gridlock, I really believe there's going to be much less gridlock because of the way this is going than any other way.
I love it. I love the way he trails off at the end of that, too. Man, it's unbelievable. And I don't think it could be made any clearer. I mean, he doesn't actually sound like that, to be true. To be sure, it is a doctored tape, although I love the effect of it. They didn't change the pitch of his voice. It's fantastic. And that it answers so many questions. And remember, the only reason we don't think Trump is a day drunk or any other time of day drunk is that he says he doesn't drink. And you know what that means? It means he's a day drinker and a night drinker and all around the clock drinker, I would guess. I see no real indication of that. That may be the one flaw in the how to read a Trump comment rule, and it may be because it's such an old comment, and it came from before he was a politician and before he completely lost his faculties. But anyway, I just want to make sure that you heard that and got the chance to appreciate it as I did. I hope we'll see more of that. I don't think I've seen Arlen Parsa do any more installments of that of late, but if I see him on the internets, I'll bring him to your attention. It really is great the way that I just want to reiterate about how he trails off that comment, and he does that so often, and people don't realize because it goes directly into other conversation. There's people talking over him all the time. When it's slowed down and it becomes really obvious that he's got no particular follow-up to the comment. Man, sometimes he can be so entertaining. If he wasn't such a jackass and president of the United States, there'd be comedy value. There would. All right, so let's get an update now on Paul Manafort's situation, or at least an update on what has been written about Paul Manafort's situation. I wanted to get to this one yesterday, and or perhaps this one came in after the show ended. Manafort's own lawyers may have hastened his downfall. I think that's something basically we knew that, and there, of course, the fact that they were responsible for the inept attempt at redacting the documents that they were filing, which allowed people to reconstruct the redacted parts. I mean, that's got to be on the lawyers, right? I mean, at best on the lawyers' secretaries, directly speaking, but that would fall to the lawyers at this point. Anyway, Natasha Bertrand wrote this one up for The Atlantic. Manafort's own lawyers may have hastened his downfall. The initial failure to redact a sensitive document was the latest in the series of missteps by Paul Manafort's lawyers. And the body of the article reads as follows. When Paul Manafort's lawyers accidentally revealed sensitive information about his contacts with a suspected Russian spy on Tuesday because of a redacting snafu, it wasn't merely a blip. Rather, it was the latest in the series of apparent missteps the legal team for President Donald Trump's former campaign chairman has made in the nearly 2 years that it's been defending the 69-year-old operative in special counsel Robert Mueller's probe. I told you I had read somewhere out there in the great ether of Twitter that this had happened to him before, and I managed to find at least a tweet that was making that allegation from the always reliable Hot Crass Buns. That's the handle that goes along with the address of Duaba D, D-U-A-B-A _D. Just a random personage I found out there on the internet. Don't know how it managed to cross my Twitter transom, but this person had said, this is Manafort's second major redaction fail. Remember, his inability to create a PDF from a Word document helped create the paper trail for his prosecutors. And there is a tweet embedded in here from Mike Scarcella, senior editor at law.com, who tweeted back on January 8th, redaction fail. Paul Manafort, defense lawyer, filing today is redacted in many parts, but the secrets are revealed. Oh, okay, this is not the old one. This is just the new one. So that doesn't really serve Hot Crass Buns. Reliable source as you are. Doesn't serve as proof of the previous one unless, is this it? Maybe this second linked tweet will help us here. This from Ars Technica. Is it Ars? A-R-S Technica? What do they say? I say Ars, but that's like too close to Arse with an E on the end. And I'm not certain that they meant that. Anyway, you know the place I'm talking about. I just don't know how it's pronounced. Anyway, this is a piece here from February of last year. How Manafort's inability to convert a PDF file to Word helped prosecutors. I won't go into that piece just now, although it looks relatively short, because it's just a side note to the piece I'm reading. But here, I guess, is the proof that they've had difficulty, or at least Manafort has had difficulty with redacting in the past. So that leads us to another story later on about why this keeps happening. But let's continue for the moment with Natasha Bertrand's story here. From publicly attacking the government's charges and opting for 2 trials instead of 1, to bizarrely maintaining a joint defense agreement with the president even after entering into a cooperation deal with the government, legal experts say Manafort's lawyers appear to have dug their client into a deep hole. From the beginning to the end, they pursued unconventional strategies, to say the least, that did not follow the usual playbook and appeared to prejudice their client, Renato Mariotti, a former federal prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois, told me. We follow along sometimes on what he has to say on Twitter. On Tuesday, their mistake was careless. The redaction error showed that prosecutors apparently believe that Manafort shared internal Trump polling data with the suspected spy Konstantin Kilimnik during the campaign. That error aside, Manafort's alleged lies to Mueller during the time he spent cooperating, which his lawyers don't want to challenge with a hearing, they revealed in Tuesday's court filings, have likely damaged his chances of getting a light sentence. Manafort's lawyers said in Tuesday's court filings that he did not intentionally lie to prosecutors. These occurrences happened during a period when Mr. Manafort was managing a U.S. presidential campaign. They wrote, "It is not surprising at all that Mr. Manafort was unable to recall specific details prior to having his recollection refreshed." There's a lot of weird speculation out there about why he keeps making such mistakes, why he keeps allowing such unconventional tactics. And of course, Greg and I had been speculating just yesterday that it seems like he wants to go to jail, because that's the best alternative to actually cooperating and then being murdered for doing it by Russian mobsters. He'll simply say, all right, well, I'll take the rap for this one. Not because he has any particular love for Trump necessarily, though it could be the case, but rather the Russians don't want to get pinched in this, and they want somebody else to go down for it. And if they don't agree to do it, they'll kill him. Manafort, though, this is the other theory that's out there. Manafort may be banking on a presidential pardon, which Trump has not ruled out, but the missteps of his attorneys appear to have done Manafort more harm than good. Mariotti pointed to the public attack on the government by Kevin Downing, Manafort's lead lawyer and a tax law specialist, following a hearing in November of 2017. He described the charges against Manafort, which included money laundering, bank fraud, and tax evasion, as ridiculous to reporters outside the courthouse, adding that there was no evidence the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. That sounds rather standard, actually. His comments led to a scolding from the judge and a court-imposed gag order. "There is no good reason to attack the prosecutors from the very beginning," Mariotti said. Downing did not respond to a request for comment. A spokesman for Manafort declined to comment as well. The unorthodox lawyering did not end there. Instead of having Manafort plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors in exchange potentially for a more lenient sentence, Manafort's lawyers effectively forced Mueller's charges into 2 separate courts, putting Manafort at risk of having to sit for 2 trials instead of 1. That also seems unorthodox, unwise. Legal experts scratched their heads at that decision. Politico described it as akin to choosing to play Russian roulette, very funny, with 2 bullets in the gun instead of 1. It was only after being convicted in Virginia on 8 counts of financial fraud that Manafort decided to sign a plea agreement and forego a separate impending trial in Washington, D.C. related to his unregistered foreign lobbying. More than 2 months after Manafort agreed to cooperate, however, it was revealed that his legal team had never pulled out of its joint defense agreement with Trump's lawyers and had been providing valuable insights about the Mueller inquiry to them. Legal experts called the arrangement extremely unusual. and potentially unethical, depending on what was discussed between Manafort's lawyers and Trump's team. Barbara McQuaid, who served as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan until 2017, said the arrangement raised questions as to whether Manafort had simply been feeding information to, or lying for, Trump. Either scenario could amount to obstruction of justice by the subjects and even their lawyers if the intent is to interfere with the investigation. A veteran Washington lawyer who declined to be named because he represents an individual involved in the Mueller probe told me at the time that he had, quote, never in my life heard of a defendant staying in a joint defense agreement after signing a plea agreement with prosecutors. He had to have known how dangerous this was, he said. Prosecutors alleged in a subsequent court filing that Manafort had breached the plea agreement by lying to the FBI and special counsel on a variety of subject matters. Manafort, who faces up to 10 years in prison from his conviction in Virginia, is set to be sentenced on March 5th. To be fair, why bother with that? But to be fair, the former federal prosecutor Eli Honig, it's E-L-I-E, Eli Honig, I don't know, said Manafort has not been the easiest client to handle. After being indicted by Mueller in October of 2017, Manafort continued to play with fire. In December, just 2 months later, he allegedly helped write an op-ed in violation of a court gag order, and he later repeatedly tried to contact witnesses in the case against him despite around-the-clock electronic surveillance. The latter offense took him from house arrest to jail, but his legal team hasn't done him any favors, Honig said. Over the course of less than a year, their client got caught obstructing justice, got convicted at trial, and then got caught lying during his cooperation, Honig said, adding that Manafort's lawyers don't appear to have stuck to one definable strategy. Another defense attorney based in Washington, D.C., who requested anonymity because he represented a client involved in the Russia probe, put it bluntly, it is definitely worth asking whether Manafort would have been better off with a public defender. Couldn't get one, though, too rich. Manafort hired his current legal team, led by Downing, just after the FBI raided his Northern Virginia home in July of 2017. 3 months later, Manafort was indicted, and Downing was attacking Mueller's charges. That clearly antagonized the government, the defense lawyer said. And that wraps it up for this particular piece. But in the way of speculation, I mean, let's see. I'm just sort of taking a look back over at the last time he had the redaction problems. I would like to at least see what it was that he was trying to redact. Oh, it was an email to Gates, I guess, in advance of that trial. Let me just run through that one. This is dated February 2018, February 23rd, and the piece by Timothy B. Lee reads as follows. Yesterday, federal prosecutors unsealed a new indictment against former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. The indictment contains new evidence that Manafort hid millions of dollars in overseas income from U.S. authorities and charges Manafort and his associate Richard Gates with numerous counts of tax and bank fraud. The indictment also suggests that Manafort's lack of technology savvy helped prosecutors build a case against Manafort and Gates. The pair allegedly submitted a variety of fraudulent documents to lenders in order to borrow money against properties purchased with overseas funds that were never reported to the IRS. One reason prosecutors were able to build a paper trail against the pair, Manafort needed Gates's help to convert a PDF document to Word format and back again. In 2016, Manafort allegedly wanted to create a fake profit and loss statement. Oh boy, coming back to me now, for his company, Davis Manafort Partners, in order to inflate his income and qualify for a loan. Manafort emailed Gates a PDF version of the real 2016 DMI P&L, profit and loss statement, I guess, which showed a loss of more than $600,000, the indictment claims. Gates converted that PDF into a Word document so that it could be edited, which Gates sent back to Manafort. Manafort altered the Word document by adding more than $3.5 million in income. Then, according to the indictment, Manafort sent this falsified P&L to Gates and asked that the Word document be converted back to a PDF, which Gates did and returned to Manafort. By sending these documents back and forth by email, Manafort and Gates made it easy for prosecutors to pinpoint exactly who changed the documents and when. In another incident earlier that same year, Manafort allegedly submitted another fraudulent profit and loss statement to a different lender with his firm's income inflated by $2 million. An employee at this lender, who was apparently aware of Manafort's ruse, replied back, "Looks DR'd, like doctored. Looks doctored. Can someone just do a clean Excel doc and PDF to me?" A subsequent version was submitted to the bank, the indictment says. Okay, so I guess that's his second, a tech fail. It's not really a redaction fail. I thought I had seen that he had made specifically a redaction failure. And I thought I had seen Empty Wheel say that, which perhaps gives me the opportunity to segue on over to an Empty Wheel blog post and tweet that allows us to speculate a little more about just what the hell Manafort is doing here. But first, it is time to kick in with the music and get ready to take our first break. But I have got, as I mentioned, I'll tease it until the other side of the break, a tweet from Empty Wheel on January 8th, hinting at her thoughts about what he might actually be doing, and then an actual write-up at emptywheel.net that goes along with it. So we'll be back in a bit and take a quick look at what she has on tap right after this short 2-minute break. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take, or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, and we left off by threatening to read you this Empty Wheel tweet here. Manafort's redaction Manafort's redaction fail tells Trump that Mueller caught him lying about his Russian handler, Konstantin Kilimnik. An entirely different look at what this might be about here. That's the headline on the piece and the text of the tweet. And she begins this way. I guess we've missed something on the run-up to this, a previous post, but don't worry about it. Boy, do I look stupid. This is Marcy saying this, not me, although I'm sure I look a little stupid too. This morning, I suggested that Robert Mueller had finally found a way to shut Paul Manafort up. Then I went away for a few hours and come back to discover Manafort's filing on the lies he got caught telling about the information he shared with Konstantin Kilimnik. The redactions covering up details of that information sharing are easily reversible, showing the following. So what actually was uncovered there. Manafort lied about 3 communications with Kilimnik is the title of this next subsection here. 2 redactions in a section of Manafort's interactions with Kilimnik hide that he went to Madrid and listened to a Kilimnik pitch on a peace plan for Ukraine. And then here are the quotes here. It begins with a parenthetical note that says C, e.g., document 460 at 5, page 5. After being shown documents, Mr. Manafort, quote, conceded that he discussed or may have discussed a Ukraine peace plan with Mr. Kilimnik on more than one occasion. Also note here id at 6. After being told that Mr. Kilimnik had traveled to Madrid on the same day that Mr. Manafort was in Madrid, Mr. Manafort, quote, acknowledged, unquote, that he and Mr. Kilimnik met while they were both in Madrid. And then a clip from later on in the redacted text reading as follows. In fact, during a proffer meeting held with the special counsel on September 11th, 2018, Mr. Manafort explained to the government attorneys and investigators that he would have given the Ukrainian peace plan more thought had the issue not been raised during the period he was engaged with work related to the presidential campaign. Issues and communications related to Ukrainian political events simply were not at the forefront of Mr. Manafort's mind during the period at issue, and it is not surprising at all that Mr. Manafort was unable to recall specific details prior to having his recollection refreshed. The same is true with regard to the government's allegation that Mr. Manafort lied about sharing polling data with Mr. Kilimnik related to the 2016 presidential campaign. Now, back to Marcy here. He excuses this lie by saying that he was just so busy with the campaign that he didn't pay attention to the requests his Russian handler was making of him during the campaign. Perhaps more damning still, given that the Russians were stealing Hillary's analytics well into September, is the revelation that Manafort shared polling data with Kilimnik, a lie about which Manafort offers no real excuse. And now in an update that she added to the post, I believe the filing means to say Manafort lied about 3 things. 1, and they are bullet pointed here, not numbered, but first, sharing polling data from the campaign, discussing a Ukraine peace deal multiple times, and the third, meeting in Madrid. Only the first definitively happened in 2016, sharing the polling data. The confusion regarding the rest stems from Manafort's excuse that he forgot all about it, or he forgot about it all, because he was running a campaign. But a number of his other excuses are stupid, so it wouldn't be surprising if this was. Next section here is Manafort claims his pattern of covering for Kilimnik doesn't amount to a pattern of covering for Kilimnik. Doesn't sound like a solid claim, does it? Most remarkable, in a brief that addresses 3 lies about Konstantin Kilimnik and 1 about Tom Barrack, who is believed to have been in the loop on at least one of their meetings, Manafort's lawyers claim there's no pattern here. Here a clip from the filing. Notably, there is no identifiable pattern to Mr. Manafort's purported misrepresentations. No specific individual or potential crime is identified in the government's submission. Marcy continues, I guess, sure, you could say there's no pattern to the many other people he attempted to protect with his obstruction, but it's clear that Kilimnik is a key one, especially given Manafort's embarrassing lawyer that in spite of Kilimnik's agreement to help him tamper with witnesses, he can't say that Kilimnik entered into a conspiracy with him. Mr. Manafort was asked to agree that Mr. Kilimnik, too, this from the filing, possessed the requisite state of mind to legally establish his guilt. Mr. Manafort balked at this characterization because he did not believe he could confirm what another person's internal thoughts or understandings were, i.e., another individual's state of mind. Next up, Manafort doesn't much care that Mueller caught him lying. Manafort's lawyers don't offer much by way of explanation for his lies. They note that he was being held in solitary, suffered from gout, and did not have an opportunity to review documents before telling these lies. But they concede that given the good faith standard on breaching the plea agreement they consented to, there is not much to argue about. So long as Mueller doesn't charge Manafort further, they won't contest the findings he breached the agreement, even while claiming the breach was not intentional. Here again from the filing, despite Mr. Manafort's position that he has not made intentional misstatements, he is not requesting a hearing on the breach issue. as requested further below, given the highly deferential standard that applies to the government's determination of a breach and the government's stated intention to limit the effect of the breach determination to its advocacy at sentencing in this case, Mr. Manafort suggests that any necessary factual determinations are better addressed as part of the pre-sentencing report process. There's a footnote to the part that says the government stated intention to limit the effect of the breach determination to its advocacy at sentencing in this case. The footnote, I guess, here reads, based upon discussions occurring after the November 30th and December 11th hearings, the OSC has advised that the only remedies it currently plans to seek related to the alleged breach relate to its position regarding sentencing in this matter. Should the government seek to bring additional charges or take any other adverse action beyond its sentencing position, the defendant reserves his right to challenge the government's breach determination at that time. Okay, another section coming up here from Marcy's piece. Manafort demands to have more witness testimony before he'll respond to other details on his lies. In a section on how Tom Barrack paid him via a third-party contractor, for what is not yet clear, Manafort suggests he can't respond because the government hasn't shared the witness statements of others alleging to the fact. The government has indicated that Mr. Manafort's statements about his payment are inconsistent with those of others, but the defense has not received any witness statements to support his contention, says his filing. And then, in a section rebutting his lies about whether or not he had contacts with the Trump administration, he claims the two instances that Mueller raised don't really count. He again demands more witness statements as follows. The first alleged misstatement identified in the special counsel's submission regarding a text exchange on May 26, 2018, related to a text message from a third party asking permission to use Mr. Manafort's name as an introduction in the event the third party met the president. This does not constitute outreach by Mr. Manafort to the president. The second example identified by the special counsel is hearsay, purportedly offered by an undisclosed third party, and the defense has not been provided with the statement or any witness statements that form the basis for alleging intentional falsehoods, though they are international in nature as well, I'm sure. Marcy comments here, then, even as agreeing there is no need to have a breach hearing, Manafort asks for more witness statements again, as follows. While a hearing regarding the government's good faith in declaring a breach of the plea agreement is not necessary, to the extent that there are witness statements that the OSC contends demonstrate Mr. Manafort's intentional falsehoods, these should be produced to the defense. After having an opportunity to review such statements and any other documentary evidence, the defendant would then suggest that the issues be narrowed during the usual sentencing process in the parties' submissions to the U.S. Probation Office in preparation of the PSR, the sentencing process. Now, on to the part about the redactions, which I found very interesting from Marcy's writing here. This mistaken non-redaction conveniently lets co-conspirators know what Mueller shared. Now here she says, I have no idea whether this non-redaction was a colossal mistake or whether this was a cute way to disclose what evidence Mueller has shared with Manafort. Remember, these 5 lies were not the only ones that Manafort told, just the only ones that Mueller wanted to describe. But even ignoring the redaction fail, the filing feels very contemptuous, as if they're still playing for a pardon. More interesting to me, though, is that first part there. The idea being, oops, we accidentally left the redactions unredactable so that you'll be able to read what's underneath it. And what is underneath it is information for the court, but not supposedly for public consumption, about exactly what Mueller is pressing Manafort on information that he's not supposed to be sharing with anybody else, not tipping off any other witnesses and not tampering with any other witnesses by telling people, say, in the administration, what information he has either given away himself or what information Mueller somehow already has. He's not supposed to tell the president, well, don't tell this lie because Mueller already knows that's not true. But, oops, I didn't redact it properly, and that's bad on me. I'm terrible at redacting. Don't I look foolish? When in fact, he may very well have released the documents and wink, wink, told somebody, all the information is in there. All you got to do is know where to look, know what I mean. And White House, in the White House, they're unredacting it and saying, now we know that Mueller already knows this. We need to change our story when we speak to him, or someone else needs to change their story. That's the theory here. But there's more. Even ignoring the redaction fail, the filing feels very contemptuous, as if they're still playing for a pardon. Effectively, they're admitting their client maybe lied or just conveniently forgot to minimize his ongoing conspiracy with someone even Rick Gates has said has ties to Russian intelligence, the same Russian intelligence that hacked Democrats. But they don't think that's a big deal. They're just going to double down on obtaining more information on the evidence Mueller has while they wait for the pardon. And one more update here. Per CNN, Manafort says this Madrid meeting was after the campaign. Okay, that makes the explanation all the more ridiculous. And she notes that she took out references to the campaign accordingly. Okay, so we do have that. The real nugget, as far as I'm concerned, was that first paragraph of the last section. The rest of the stuff, well, I thought I would include it as far as giving context, but I think it actually ended up taking away from our ability to focus on the one part I wanted, and that's part of that's the consequence of parachuting into the middle of one of Marcy Wheeler's trains of thought. But I hope that we didn't lose you, and you've instead carried away the sneaking suspicion that maybe that redaction mistake wasn't a mistake after all. That would really be something. Now, Empty Wheels got another entry in the blog from yesterday, the 10th, that makes some corrections, I guess, or notes some corrections that were made by the New York Times, as a matter of fact. The headline here, Paul Manafort's ongoing conspiracy with suspected Russian agent Konstantin Kilimnik. That's not the news. The news is down here. Because the New York Times corrected an error, noting that Paul Manafort instructed Konstantin Kilimnik to pass on Trump polling data to pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarchs. Let's see how we're going to get these names out. Sergei Leovochkin. How about that? Sergei Leovochkin and Rinat Akhmetov, not Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. The usual suspects are claiming that the really damning disclosures revealed by Paul Manafort's filing the other day don't yet prove Trump's campaign manager conspired with Russia. I guess the thought is, well, he conspired with Ukrainians. Okay. Now, the next section of her piece here, Manafort already pled guilty to conspiring with Russian Konstantin Kilimnik, so that takes care of conspiring with Russians. I saw claims as recently as the other day that no Trump associate has been charged or pled guilty to conspiring with a Russian. That's false. As part of his plea agreement in September, Manafort pled guilty to conspiring with Kilimnik, a Russian citizen, to witness tamper. Admittedly, this particular conspiracy took place in 2018, not 2016, and it served not to tamper with the 2016 election, but to hide the ways in which Manafort kept secret that he was an agent of Ukraine, spending millions to influence U.S. policy. But, as Mueller described it, Manafort committed a series of crimes designed to hide his ongoing ties to Russian-backed Ukrainian oligarchs after being fired from the Trump campaign in significant part to sustain lies he and Rick Gates told while still working for Donald Trump. In other words, One purpose of his conspiracy with Kilimnik was to hide the fact that Trump's campaign manager, who in spite of being broke, worked for free, as she puts it in quotes here, throughout the campaign, had been a paid agent of Ukraine. Next section, the Russian Manafort conspired with, Konstantin Kilimnik, is suspected of ties to the same agency that hacked the DNC. Past Mueller filings have made it clear that Kilimnik is suspected to have ties to a Russian intelligence agency. The FBI thinks so, and says so here. Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents assisting the special counsel's office assessed that Kilimnik has ties to Russian intelligence, the Russian intelligence service, and had such ties in 2016. And Rick Gates knew of those ties. During his first interview with the special counsel's office, Alex van der Zwaan, remember that guy, admitted that he knew of that connection, stating that Gates told him, Kilimnik, Gates told van der Zwaan that Kilimnik was a former Russian intelligence officer with the GRU. The GRU, of course, is the Russian intelligence agency that hacked the Democrats in 2016. So, Manafort has pled to conspiring not just with any Russian, but a Russian believed to have ties with the agency that hacked the DNC. Akhmetov, or Akhmetov, perhaps, was named in the same interview as Deripaska in the affidavit for a 2017 probable cause search warrant targeting Manafort. Akhmetov, one of the oligarchs with whom New York Times' correction say Manafort did share data, was described in the probable cause warrant the FBI used to raid Manafort's condo in July of 2017. Indeed, Manafort described working for both Akhmetov and I'm going to go with Akhmetov on that. And Deripaska, in the same period, he was supporting Viktor Yanukovych. This suggests it's difficult to separate Manafort's historical criminal behavior involving Akhmetov from that involving Deripaska, and Kilimnik was involved in both. Next section, Akhmetov and Lyovochkin. Yeah, I'm going to start. Lyovochkin were paying Manafort while he was working for Trump for free. As part of Manafort's spokesman's clarifications about the disclosures made clear in the redacted filing, he admitted that a $2.4 million payment Manafort anticipated in an August 2016 email to his accountant that he would receive in November was from Akhmetov and Lyovochkin. Oh my goodness, what a name. While that payment is understood to be debts owed for past work, his decision to share campaign data with the oligarchs seems to have been tied to ensuring that he did get that payment. And I guess this is some of the material from, I don't know where, it looks like emails here, August 10th, 2016, Paul Manafort writing, I guess, to the accountant, Cindy, the 2016 P&L should reflect collection of income earned in Ukraine of $2.4 million. That is to be collected in November. The $1.5 million should be listed as income. Please correct the P&L. That to Cindy Laporta of his accounting agency, I guess. And a response back on that, also embedded in here. If that's right, if these figures are right, and I guess this is... Well, we might as well read her answer here. Cindy says, "Hi, Paul. I'm working with David at Citizens Bank regarding 2 last pieces needed for loan approval. 1, DMP 2016 P&L shows $1.5 million in income. How much more is expected in 2016? Is the $1.5 million income or a loan?" Okay, that's the email that he's responding to there. Okay. If that's right, it suggests that the $2.4 million payment at a time when Manafort was broke, but nevertheless working for free, he had some tie to his work on the campaign, or it had some tie to his work on the campaign. Lyovochkin. Okay. Boy, I got to keep working on this one. Lyovo, Lyovo, Chkin, Chkin, Lyovochkin, made an illegal donation to Donald Trump's inauguration fund, my favorite slush fund. Another Kalimnik business partner, Sam Patton, pled guilty, in part, to laundering a $50,000 donation to Trump's inauguration fund for tickets to his inauguration. And a clip here from, where are we looking? A couple of these clips have come from the same source. Courtlistener.com, government court transcripts, I guess. To circumvent the foreign donation restriction, Patton, with the knowledge of foreigner A, solicited a United States citizen to act as a straw purchaser so that he could conceal from the Presidential Inauguration Committee that the tickets for the inauguration were being paid for from a foreign source. The straw purchaser paid $50,000 for 4 inauguration tickets. The straw purchaser paid that sum one day after receiving from Begimont Ventures a check signed by Patton in the sum of $50,000. In turn, our guy here, Leo Vochkin, paid Begimot, I guess, Begimot, I don't know, Begemot, that's Begimot Ventures, for the tickets through a Cypriot account. How fun. Kalimnik and Leovochkin, another Ukrainian, and Patton were allocated the 4 inauguration tickets. Thereafter, Patton attended a Presidential Inauguration Committee event in Washington, D.C. with Leovochkin. Thus, Marcy returns, in addition to paying Trump's campaign manager during the campaign, Leovochkin made an illegal donation to Trump's inauguration. And remember, there are outstanding questions about where all the inauguration funds went. Manafort, next up, discussed Ukraine every time he spoke with Kalimnik during the campaign. Those discussions included a Russian-friendly peace plan. Among the other lies Manafort told when he was supposed to be cooperating with Mueller pertained to his repeated conversations with Kalimnik. And while Manafort tried to minimize the persistence with which they discussed such things, suggesting he may have discussed a Ukraine peace plan more than once. After being shown documents, Mr. Manafort conceded that he discussed or may have discussed a Ukraine peace plan with Mr. Kalimnik on more than one occasion. Marcy concludes, but Mueller maintains they have detailed descriptions showing the peace plan came up at each meeting they had, which suggests it was a key part of why the Russians and Ukrainians in touch with Manafort through Kalimnik were in touch with him. And again, both these lies and Manafort's lies in 2018 and Manafort's lies in 2016 and 2017 were all intended to hide these ongoing relationships, in significant part to hide Trump's campaign ties to all of this. There we have it. I think we're up to date. Who knows what could still break later on. But while we have you mulling these things over, no pun intended, it's not a Mueller joke, this actually all reminded me, particularly the idea that Manafort was purposefully bungling his case, including bungling the redacting, for continued criminal purpose. It actually reminded me of something I read a long time ago, and I thought this may be too crazy to even put in pocket. But I don't know. Let's pull it out here, because word has broken that Michael Cohen has agreed to testify before a House investigative committee, and to do so publicly. And I'm pretty sure I put that one aside. Yeah, I just happened to grab a CNN article on it, just by way of being able to supply you with a link to show that that's the case. Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, to testify publicly before Congress. We'll see when and where. Michael Cohen will testify before the House Oversight Committee, the first major move by House Democrats to haul in a member of Trump's team connected to Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. According to a schedule published by the committee, of course there has to be auto-playing video with that. No television station could possibly resist. Cohen has agreed to testify publicly before the panel on February 7th, according to a statement from Cohen. So that's pretty interesting. And it's still pre-sentencing for him, I believe. So it will be interesting, to see what they can wring out of him. But a very different picture is painted by this little piece of speculation in a publication I know nothing about called The Weaklings, like Weeklings, The Weaklings. I don't know whether that's what the hell that's supposed to mean. But here's a piece. Who's written this? I can't tell. Where's the authorship? Is it down here at the bottom? Greg O'Lear. Greg O'Lear, founding editor of The Weaklings and author of the novels Totally Killer and Father Mucker. Oh boy, I don't know what that is. And LA Times bestseller. So, tells me nothing. But here's the very weird and speculative piece. And I came to it, man, I'm not even sure how I found it. It was a while ago, but I found it in, probably like maybe through one of Der Wooter's threads or something. And there's a photo in here by a woman by the name of Allison Green, who, if I recall correctly, is another one of these like super into it. The term conspiracy theorist is a little too loaded for describing some of these people, but there's definitely an area of, or a gray area where people are putting together some really like deeply conspiratorial sounding speculation threads. And anyway, Allison Green happens to have taken the picture that illustrates this piece. And I got the sense that Greg O'Lear and she talk, at least on Twitter, about their theories on these guys. And this one's a bit of a weird one. Michael Cohen, the speculation is all in the headline. Maybe that's all you even need here. Michael Cohen, Trump's fixer or his handler? Would you buy that one? This is from way back in May 3rd of last year, 2018. And I'll give you a little taste of it here before we break off for the top of the hour. It starts this way. While I have long grouped Michael Cohen with Paul Manafort, Mike Flynn, Jared Kushner, Jeff Sessions, and Donald Trump, Père et Fils, my goodness, of course he has to throw me some French, yes, just to be cute, as the seditious seven with regard to Trump-Russia, I have heretofore operated under the assumption that Cohen was subordinate to Trump. Okay, sounds familiar enough. After all, he is routinely described as Donald Trump's personal attorney and portrayed in the press as a loyal henchman of the kind found in the company of the Joker on the old Batman show. But what if I have it all wrong? What if Michael Cohen is not Trump's fixer, but rather his handler? That's a possibility. His personal liaison to the Russian mob. What if Cohen outranks Trump on the org chart? We'll consider that after the break. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio, and getting right back into what we needed to consider at the other side of the break. He actually says, consider. We know Cohen had, quote, mob ties from a fairly young age. Felix Sater is his childhood chum. Don't forget that. Whatever color Sater's hat ultimately turns out to be, he's been an FBI informant long enough that he may wind up being one of the good guys, marginally. His father was very much affiliated with the Russian mob. If Sater and Cohen were childhood friends, it follows that Cohen knew Sater's old man, too. I hate that usage of two, but two instead of also. Cohen's father-in-law also, I guess that's why he went with no, two also has questionable ties to organized crime, which he abbreviates here as OC. I guess he uses that later, so we might as well introduce you to that. Oh, and Cohen has himself boasted that he works for the Russian mob, which seems kind of relevant. What is that even from? It's linked, in case you want to assess that. It's actually a Business Insider piece from April of 2018, Michael Cohen once reportedly bragged that he was part of the Russian mob. Well, that's the headline anyway. Any details that we can quickly glean from this? According to the Journal, Cohen once told someone at a former friend's wedding that he belonged to the Russian mob. The former friend, Gregory Ehrlich, said he does not believe Cohen has any such ties. Cohen has been described at different times as Trump's fixer, pit bull, and consigliere. Or I would say, I guess, consigliere. Add that final vowel for the Italian. He has known Trump for decades and began working at the Trump Organization in 2007. He left the company in 2017 to serve as Trump's personal lawyer. Well, anyway, it does go on from there, but I guess really the meat of it is he once bragged that. Who knows? Maybe he was just drunk. I don't know, but he said it. Sometimes the truth comes out that way. Anyway, that does seem kind of relevant, or it would be brought up, I'm sure, if everybody else thought so too. We know that Cohen went to literally the worst law school in the United States. You know, like a mobster would. We know he doesn't actually practice that much law. His revenue comes from other business interests, real estate, taxi medallions, we learned about that one, fine art, hush money payouts. The fine art should be kept in mind, though. Hush money payouts, insurance scams, and getting nosy people to lay off Mr. Trump. These are activities that mobsters engage in, because most of them are ideal avenues to launder dirty money, which is why mobsters have their offices and homes and hotel suites raided by the FBI, like he does. Anyway, Cohen is a major figure in the Steele dossier. Of Americans, only Carter Page is mentioned more, but if we go through the known meetings between Russians and Trump campaign members, Cohen only pops up twice. And remember, that number is now apparently acknowledged to be over 100, by the way. How many people were caught at the border terrorists? 4,000? No, 6. How many contacts did you have with Russians in the campaign? 0. 100? You know, you get the idea. In late August of 2016, he meets in Prague or some other European city with unnamed Russians, or at least his cell phone does, we found out later. In December of that same year, he and his old friend Sater meet in New York with Andriy V. Artemenko, a pro-Putin Ukrainian politician, to negotiate sanctions. Cohen delivers their proposal by hand to then incoming National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. Perhaps Cohen and Sater were not there to negotiate, but rather to receive marching orders from Semyon Mogilevich via Artemenko to pass along to Trump via Flynn. We know there are really weird financial dealings on Cohen's books. The Stormy Daniels payout, which money he said he procured by taking out a home equity line of credit. The $1.4 million payout to the knocked-up Playboy model. The not-yet-explained dealings with Sean Hannity. We know that Mueller outsourced the Cohen raid to the Southern District of New York, a district with familiarity prosecuting mob operations. We know that his daughter was so unfazed by the FBI raid that this was her first Instagram post after it went down. It is embedded here, and it's her in a bikini in a sauna. I don't really know what that's supposed to mean, but he's got an idea. Subtext: it takes a sauna to make a Cohen sweat. Well, that may be reaching a little bit. But anyway, we know that during the campaign, Cohen sounded like a mobster when he declared of the polls showing Trump losing, says who. We all do remember that one, don't we? He may well have followed that with, that's some nice polling data. Shame if anything were to happen to it. It certainly had that flavor anyway. But, okay, again, a bit of a stretch. We know there was a fire in apartment 50C at Trump Tower. Now watch out for this one. Ready? An apartment owned by a destitute former art dealer, one of very few 4-alarm fires in a New York high-rise. I don't know whether that's really true, but okay. We know the fire started in the adjacent apartment, which was vacant. Do we? We know that a lot of priceless art went up in flames. Unless it didn't. Okay. We also know that Cohen, who was not in the building at the time, warned a friend who was to get out of Trump Tower because of a fire. The man said there was no smoke and no alarms when the message was received. How did Cohen know about the fire before people in the building did? Maybe not, but okay. Allison Green, who I mentioned earlier, who witnessed and photographed Cohen and his cronies after the professional journalists left. And he lacks a transition here, but I think I can help put it in context for you. After the professional journalists left, where? This was, remember, this article is written in May 3rd, 2018. This was the time he was seen hanging out outside of his apartment building with friends smoking cigars instead of showing up for a scheduled court date. Do you remember this? All right. So there's the mention of the fire, which kind of sort of comes back later, or actually there's some linked articles which are of some conspiratorial interest here. But okay, so Allison Green takes the picture of him hanging out with his friends. She suggests that the cigar photos were staged and for a sinister purpose. The cast of characters surrounding Cohen and his $3,000 sport jacket all seem to have Russian OC ties, notably Rotem Rosen. His name has come up in the past. Is Putin's crew sending a message that they own Cohen? She writes. And does Cohen not care about being in court because Russia's going to protect him? Is Cohen showing his allegiance, and has Russia promised him he's safe? Or is Putin's crew testing Cohen's loyalty with the public display? It's all very interesting. I think it was probably more interesting speculation before he ended up pleading out and agreeing to come and testify before Congress. But it does make you wonder whether he was always a slippery guy, and I always wondered whether we were getting the truth out of him. We should definitely view his testimony and his deals with a jaundiced eye, I think. Our writer here continues on. Green may be on to something here. In Russia, organized crime is fully integrated with the intelligence services, with the oligarchs, and with the actual government, which is interesting, but okay. The two most powerful people in Russia are Vladimir Putin, who is the richest oligarch, the head of the intelligence community, and the president. And the other is Semyon the Brainy Don Mogilevich, the capo de tutti capi of the Russian mob. They are like the emperor and the patriarch in the Byzantine Empire. Humorously enough, he says, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell in Congress. I don't think that's much of a comparison, but okay. They work together intimately and run the country like the mobsters they are. When we say Cohen works for the Russian mob, then what we mean is that he also works for Putin. Russia is run by its oligarchs, its intelligence services, and its mob. They work in tandem, or rather in troika, but they are not a monolith. Perhaps each tentacle of the operation has both Russian and American intermediaries. To wit, among the oligarchs, Oleg Deripaska and Dmitro Firtash, working through Paul Manafort. The Russian Foreign Service, here Sergei Kislyak and Sergei Lavrov working through Mike Flynn, Jared Kushner, and Jeff Sessions. GRU and the Russian intelligence services working through Natalia Veselnitskaya and Donald Trump Jr. Vladimir Putin's office working through Arkady Dvorkovich, Igor Sechin, and they're on through to Carter Page. And Russian OC through Semyon Mogilevich, Felix Sater, Rotem Rosen, and ultimately Michael Cohen. Again, I've long assumed that Manafort and Flynn are the key figures here, with the likes of Kushner and Jr. being led astray as the campaign went along. Perhaps Michael Cohen is more than just an enabler. It's an interesting thought. I don't know how much credence I give the theory, but it's Friday, and I thought I would throw that in there just to see if I could break your brain before the weekend. Tell me if it worked. Now I have to switch gears once again. It's going to be all about gear switching, I think, to bring you an update on a topic we touched on last week, and from a source that we used to touch on it last week, David Dayan, revisiting the PAYGO situation. And here's an interesting twist he finds. You remember he asks that PAYGO law we were talking about all last week, the statutory PAYGO, remember? That, the last Congress violated it, of course. In other words, they didn't use their PAYGO, they didn't meet their PAYGO obligations in passing some of the more expensive bills that they passed. They waived them, and they didn't come up with a legislative fix for it at any point. And so now the situation is there has yet to be a legislative patch, that is how he refers to a legislative PAYGO pay for that will make up their obligations so that the statutory PAYGO authority in the White House doesn't kick in, the backstop PAYGO. And that was given as the reason why we needed to retain some sort of PAYGO rule in the House rules during the initial House rules fight. Because otherwise, if we didn't require programs to be paid for in CBO's eyes, the White House would be able to be the backstop on that, and we would have left that authority in the hands of Donald Trump, which is another storyline that we should probably get to perhaps in some point during our last hour or so. But if we don't, we don't. But okay. Anyway, catching up on this. So the legislative patch, the pay-fors that they didn't come up with, were apparently included in the CR that would have avoided the shutdown. But of course, that never went through. And so the PAYGO obligations have never shown up. And apparently, if they don't show up by January 24th, which is coming up, then White House statutory authority kicks in, and we are right where we all were supposed to fear we would be if we didn't include PAYGO rules in the Democratic rules package the other day. Now, David brings that up and then points us to a roll call article, which I have here, and we'll try and run through this one quickly. White House to put Medicare cuts on hold during shutdown. This is Paul M. Krausek writing at Roll Call. Pay-as-you-go law would force cuts if shutdown lingers until January 24th. Okay, so far. Now, the Trump administration, it says here, won't order up a round of cuts in federal benefit programs, primarily Medicare, if the partial government shutdown remains in effect later this month, a senior Office of Management and Budget official said. If the shutdown lingers until January 24th, under current law, the OMB would be forced to slice around $839 million from non-exempt programs across the government. That number represents the figure left on the pay-as-you-go scorecard for 2018, specifying the net amount added to the fiscal 2019 deficit by laws enacted last year, excluding emergency spending that is exempt from the calculation. About 90% of the cuts, or $753 million, would come from Medicare, the major health insurance program for the elderly. But the senior OMB official said the administration wouldn't execute the cuts right away, as the relevant documentation is on hold during the shutdown. Once the lapse is over, we will reassess timing for releasing these documents, the official said. Under the 2010 law establishing the statutory pay-as-you-go requirement, if there is a positive scorecard balance at the end of a congressional session, the OMB has not later than 14 days, not counting weekends and holidays, to issue a sequestration order specifying cuts for the ongoing fiscal year. The OMB's latest scorecard balance for last year was $482 million, as of December 14th and would rise to $839 million after accounting for enactment of the 2018 Farm Bill on December 20th, based on calculations by CQ, that's Congressional Quarterly. Independent analysis at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget said they'd reached similar conclusions. The senior OMB official, however, said the Farm Bill estimate was produced by the Congressional Budget Office, which can differ from the White House interpretation. The official also said there were some other minor bills enacted before the end of last year that will have budgetary effects that are part of the calculation. The stopgap funding bills lawmakers were considering in December to avert the partial shutdown would have delayed the sequestration order until 15 days after the continuing resolution's February 8th expiration. The idea was to buy time to enact broader appropriations legislation for the full fiscal year ending September 30th that would wipe the pay-as-you-go scorecard clean, thereby eliminating potential automatic cuts in mandatory programs. House Democrats included such a provision in their 6-bill omnibus measure they sent to the Senate last week to reopen 8 cabinet departments and numerous other agencies. But Senate Republicans have shown no interest in that bill, which President Donald Trump said he would veto. Without either the stopgap bill's delayed sequester start date or the pay-as-you-go waiver in the larger spending bill, it would place the date of an OMB sequestration order around January 24th. Okay, so now that's a pretty good explanation. Congress routinely exempts spending increases and tax cuts from pay-as-you-go enforcement or wipes out the pay-as-you-go scorecard at the end of the year. If the cuts eventually are triggered, it would be the first time since the 2010 law was enacted. The White House will update its estimates in putting together the next sequestration order, but based on the OMB's report for a separate fiscal 2019 sequester of mandatory programs required under a 2011 deficit reduction law, Medicare would bear the brunt of the cuts. The programs targeted by a pay-as-you-go sequester would be similar to those that are cut each year under the mandatory sequester from the 2011 law. Is that super committee? Oh my goodness. Is that how long ago we're talking about? In addition to Medicare, those programs include risk adjustment payments to insurers with sicker enrollees under the 2010 healthcare law, student loan administration, payments to the Fund for Military Retirees, and vocational rehabilitation services for individuals with disabilities, among others. In other words, programs that, at least in normal times, no one wants to see cut. It would also hit Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement operations, which are central to the broader standoff between Democrats and Trump on reopening the government. And it would curb payments to farmers who are already having trouble as a result of the shutdown, getting assistance to cope with lost export markets due to Trump's tariffs. Many programs are exempt from sequester, including Medicaid, Social Security, veterans programs, food stamps, federal retiree benefits, and unemployment compensation, among others. But Medicare, which is not exempt, would see the lion's share of the new cuts because it's so massive. The OMB's February 2018 sequestration order estimated the program would cost $697.9 billion in fiscal 2019, versus just $80.2 billion for all other non-exempt programs combined. The OMB official said those figures likely would change somewhat as part of the official calculation after the shutdown ends, however. The $839 million left on the pay-as-you-go scorecard for the second session of the 115th Congress would represent about 0.11% of the total spending in non-exempt programs for fiscal 2019, based on the OMB's estimates last February. Applying that percentage reduction to Medicare would produce cuts of roughly $753 million starting in late January, with the remainder spread across other non-exempt programs. That's not much in the context of such a huge benefit program, which is already subject to $14 billion in cuts this year under the 2011 law's sequester. But it's likely to come as a surprise to hospitals, doctors, and other stakeholders who would see their Medicare reimbursements cut as part of an unrelated fight over funding a wall along the southwest border. So, you get where we're standing here? Back to David Dayen, who says, hey, remember that PAYGO law we were talking about last week? Congress violated it, sort of. It's not really the way I would put it, but and there hasn't been a legislative patch yet. So across-the-board cuts are imminent by January 24th, unless there's some other action, right? Now he continues. The framing here, he says, is bad. This has nothing to do with the shutdown. That was just the vehicle for the legislative patch. Congress could pass a standalone patch to avert the cuts. But wait. The shutdown is actually preventing cuts from going into effect, or at least that's an excuse that they're using, I would say. At least that is OMB's interpretation, which gets back to what we said last week. Nobody actually wants to trigger statutory PAYGO, mainly because it's an automatic sequester that mostly hits Medicare. So this idea, he posits, that the House had to have a PAYGO rule or they give Donald Trump the power to make cuts is, again, revealed as BS. Not entirely, but it does show that there's a hole in the automatic part of it. Trump doesn't want to make the cuts. He's arguably breaking the law not to make the cuts. I say breaking the law because the statute is clear about having 14 days after the PAYGO scorecard is complete to enact the cuts, shutdown or no. And to be clear, $839 million in cuts in the context of the overall budget is minor, as is $753 million from Medicare. But without congressional action, that'll have to come from somewhere. So, very interesting. And I find that worth noting, although not entirely persuasive. For one thing, I guess I would say off the top of my head, you have 14 days after the PAYGO scorecard is complete to enact the cuts, not counting weekends and holidays, and I could find it within my heart. I find it would be pretty easy, I think, for a judge or anybody else to come to the conclusion that a shutdown, while not exactly a fun holiday, would count in staying that time limit. That's easy enough to imagine. And secondly, I guess it's not entirely clear to me that Trump doesn't want to now or wouldn't want to at some point in the future to make those cuts on his own. It doesn't really convince me that when push comes to shove, a president or a White House and OMB would never implement those cuts. It does tell me that there are times when they would try and finagle the numbers so as to avoid having to make some or all of those cuts or avoid making them at a certain time. But it doesn't tell me that the ironclad rule of sequestration is that no one puts it into effect. After all, we did have a couple mentions in there of the 2011 bill and its sequestration mandates, which I think we all pretty famously remember, were also all about the kinds of cuts that nobody would be willing to make and nobody would be willing to allow to happen. No one would want to be held responsible for. Everybody hated sequestration, so super committee would succeed. And it very famously did not. And I don't think David Dayen thought for a moment that it would. So, I don't know. There's some facts out there that could definitely temper his analysis, but it's an interesting point nonetheless. We'll put it out there as a data point in case someone wants to come around and connect, collect, or otherwise count these dots. All right, we have 2 minutes before our break steps in here and cuts us off. So I want to put two things on the record that I need to warn you about, I think. Going into the weekend, we've brought up both of them in the past, but things are heating up on those fronts. We'll probably only be able to get to one of them on the other side of the break. Two things still looming out there. One, I am sure you haven't forgotten about because it was the more recent of the two. The worry that Democratic members of the House in particular, and I guess also in the Senate, were tying their willingness to even consider the appropriateness of impeachment as a remedy to possibly their receipt of and personal review of the Mueller report. Now, we have gone over that and as Greg has illustrated, and he sent me even more writing on this subject, there are plenty of ways, redundant ways, that I think that Mueller and those who have worked with him and had his back have to make sure that the information does eventually become public. Although, again, that's not the same thing as giving the report to members of Congress necessarily. But there are several ways that the information can get out there. But I think the safer thing to do, as I've said, is to simply say, well, we'll see what happens with the report, but it needs to be said that attempting to block the release of the report to Congress or to the public, or either of the things really, might in itself be an impeachable offense, and we should just draw that line early and make it clear. The other we have spoken about and we read a little bit about, but we haven't returned to the subject, but that has to do with the emergency declaration, or at least the possibility of an emergency declaration. And we began reading the Atlantic piece on the various specific powers and other statutory authority that is triggered along with a national emergency declaration. It was a big, long article. That's the one I think we'll probably comb through after the break. But both of these things need to be on your radar, and I'll tell you a little bit after the break more about why you have to worry about the first as well. The second may come sooner. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption, though it's still aimed at saying thank you to all of you who are supporters of the show. We've made a lot of progress. When we first started this campaign, fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners were donating to help keep us on the air, and now that's down to about 1 in 15, but we've got a long way to go. Remember, it won't take much. Our average monthly donation is currently about $7, for which you're getting 2 hours of great news and entertainment 5 days a week. What's that, 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. But as a wage, well, I think Democrats would be against that. But if we all put our 70 cents together, or even half of us, that'd really be something. And my kids could go to college. Now, that's not all on you, but remember, patreon.com, Patreon.com, is there to make it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X, or David Waldman, or Kagro in the Morning, or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right there where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your continuing support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're into our last segment on this Friday. And as I said, there are two things I want you to consider in parallel going into the weekend. The possibility that the White House might attempt to block or partially block or at least delay the release either to Congress or the public or both of parts of the Mueller report gets new life every day. But taking a look at NBC News' latest report, White House beefs up legal team with 17 new attorneys to battle Democrats and Mueller. Subheader here, such a strategy could quickly inflame tensions between Trump and congressional Democrats and could lead to lengthy legal battles. That's the key part there. The lengthy legal battles are what it's all about, and they may hope only to be able to delay things for long enough that we get close to the next election, or even the election after that, for that matter, or the one after that even, and Democrats fall back on the George W. Bush impeachment playbook. Don't talk about it. Don't bring it up. It's bad. It's a gift to Trump if we discuss it, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be all that's necessary for him to skate on this thing. They just plain run out of time. Even though, of course, if it were to happen in the run-up to 2020 and be more or less shelved during the election time, impeachment proceedings, one of the few things that actually survives from one Congress to the next, even when the House adjourns sine die. Although I suppose that would be the case only if impeachment articles, I don't really know now that I think about it, but I would guess it's when impeachment articles are adopted. If it gets kicked over to the Senate, the dissolution of the House does nothing as far as they're concerned. I mean, ordinary bills, though, that doesn't work for. That's true. That's probably because you can't return the bill to the House in the case of any disagreement. but I don't think that they even give it a chance. But, of course, impeachment wouldn't come back to the House. Once it's kicked to the Senate, it belongs to the Senate, and the House has no role in it, and the Senate is supposedly a continuing body, though I disagree with that assessment. I'd let it slide on this one. Anyway, like I said, that one's the longer-term worry for me. But I'll just give you the first couple paragraphs here of this piece by Alan Smith. The White House has beefed up its legal team in recent weeks, hiring 17 additional lawyers to help prevent President Donald Trump's discussions with top advisors from being obtained by House Democrats or revealed to Special Counsel Robert Mueller, the Washington Post reports. It's not exactly about blocking the release of the report, but blocking the completion of the report, which is another issue. The White House plan is to assert Trump's executive privilege on both fronts. That strategy is being led by new White House counsel Pat Cipollone, depending on how he might pronounce that last name. And aides said the goal is to preserve a legal protection that past presidents have invoked. But with Democrats planning to go as far as subpoenaing the administration for information, such a strategy could quickly inflame tensions between the two sides and may lead to lengthy legal battles. That may be all they're after in all of this. There's a lot to it, and it's well worth considering, and one of these days we'll give a closer consideration to the merits of such an executive privilege claim, but I wanted to put that one out there. That, by the way, just one of 2 or 3 such pieces that I have socked away here somewhere. There is, here we are, the Hills report from January 7th. Michael Burke's filing here, and I got to kill their auto-playing video, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Just clicking out of it doesn't actually kill this damn stuff. Anyway, that headline reads, White House may try to block release of parts of final Mueller report. Mueller findings, according to a different report here. The White House may try to use executive privilege to keep parts of the special counsel of Robert Mueller's I've screwed up the sentence here, but you get the idea, of his final report from being made public, Bloomberg News reported Monday, citing unidentified sources. But once again, executive privilege central to both. Now, this a claim being made by Rudy Giuliani, the worst of Donald Trump's remaining lawyers. I don't know how good Pat Cipollone is, but he's not a internationally renowned ass clown, as is Rudy Giuliani. I don't think. He's not world-renowned anyway, because I don't know who he is. Anyway, like I said, the bigger issue, the more immediate issue, is the question of emergency powers, because I remain convinced that he wants to try to do this, and they keep hinting that he's really working hard. That is to say, he's yelling at people to work hard for him to get this thing done. We began reading, and I'll try and skip down to the more relevant parts, this piece from The Atlantic, what the president could do if he declares a state of emergency. It was Elizabeth Goitein, whose name we didn't know how to pronounce then or now, who actually is affiliated with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. And she was setting it up very poetically and rather at length. And some of the setup that we didn't get to yet is actually kind of important in terms of understanding why we have the statutory regime we have. We made it down, I think, as far as the part where she notes for us that Abraham Lincoln had conceded that his unilateral suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War was constitutionally questionable, right? But defended it as necessary to preserve the Union. We got a small taste of the sorts of things that past presidents have tried. There was the mention of the Youngstown Steel case that Armando had discussed with us, right? And then I think we probably got right down to about to there and left off. And here I would pick up with this description. Presidents can also rely on a cornucopia of powers provided by Congress, which has historically been the principal source of emergency authority for the executive branch. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, Congress passed laws to give the president additional leeway during military, economic, and labor crises. The more formalized approach evolved in the early 20th century when Congress legislated powers that would lie dormant until the president activated them by declaring a national emergency. It's kind of a key to all this. These statutory authorities begin to pile up, and because presidents had little incentive to terminate states of emergency once declared, these piled up too. By the 1970s, hundreds of statutory emergency powers and 4 clearly obsolete states of emergency were in effect. For instance, the national emergency that Truman declared in 1950 during the Korean War remained in place and was being used to help prosecute the war in Vietnam. Aiming to rein in this proliferation, Congress passed the National Emergencies Act in 1976, and we got mention of that one when Greg passed us that article from his flu work, I think. Under this law, the president still has complete discretion to issue an emergency declaration, but he must specify in the declaration which powers he intends to use, issue public updates if he decides to invoke additional powers, and report to Congress on the government's emergency-related expenditures every 6 months. The state of emergency expires after a year unless the president renews it, and the Senate and the House must meet every 6 months while the emergency is in effect, quote, to consider a vote, unquote, on termination. All they have to do is consider a vote. But take note of that because it's no help. By any objective measure, the law has failed. 30 states of emergency are in effect today, several times more than when the act was passed. Most have been renewed for years on end, and during the 40 years the law has been in place, Congress has not met even once, let alone every 6 months, to vote on whether to end them. And I think that the law is somewhat unclear there. They say that they have to meet every 6 months to consider a vote, which only means, I think, was meant to be that you can't dissolve or suspend Congress. They have to be able to get together at least every 6 months to decide not to decide anything. Anyway, I think that's what has basically happened. As a result, the president has access to emergency powers contained in 123 statutory provisions, as recently calculated by the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, where I work, where she works anyway. These laws address a broad range of matters from military composition to agricultural exports to public contracts. For the most part, the president is free to use any of them. The National Emergencies Act doesn't require that the powers invoked relate to the nature of the emergency. Even if the crisis at hand is, say, a nationwide crop blight, the president may activate the law that allows the Secretary of Transportation to requisition any privately owned vessel at sea. Many other laws permit the executive branch to take extraordinary action under specified conditions such as war and domestic upheaval, regardless of whether a national emergency has been declared. This legal regime for emergencies, ambiguous constitutional limits combined with a rich well of statutory emergency powers would seem to provide the ingredients for a dangerous encroachment on American civil liberties. Yet, so far, even though presidents have often advanced dubious claims of constitutional authority, egregious abuses on the scale of the Japanese American internment or the post-9/11 torture program have been rare, but they've happened, and most of the statutory powers available during a national emergency have never been used. But what's to guarantee that this president, or a future one, will show the reticence of his predecessors? To borrow from Justice Robert Jackson's dissent in Korematsu, the 1944 Supreme Court decision that upheld internment of Japanese Americans, each emergency power lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. It's a little scary. New section here called an Internet Kill Switch, ? Like all emergency powers, the laws governing the conduct of war allow the president to engage in conduct that would be illegal during ordinary times. This conduct includes familiar incidents of war, such as the killing or indefinite detention of enemy soldiers. But the president can also take a host of other actions, both abroad and inside the United States. These laws vary dramatically in content and scope. Several of them authorize the president to make decisions about the size and composition of the armed forces that are usually left to Congress. Although such measures can offer needed flexibility at crucial moments, they are subject to misuse. For instance, George W. Bush leveraged the state of emergency after 9/11 to call hundreds of thousands of reservists and members of the National Guard into active duty in Iraq for a war that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. Other powers are chilling under any circumstances. Take a moment to consider that during a declared war or national emergency, the president can unilaterally suspend the law that bars government testing of biological and chemical agents on unwitting human subjects. Ugh. One power poses a singular threat to democracy in the digital era. In 1942, Congress amended Section 706 of the Communications Act of 1934 to allow the president to shut down or take control of, quote, any facility or station for wire communication, unquote. And upon his proclamation, quote, that there exists a state or threat of war involving the United States, unquote, resurrecting a similar power Congress had briefly provided Woodrow Wilson during World War I. At the time, wire communication meant telephone calls or telegrams. Given the relatively modest role that electronic communications played in most Americans' lives, the government's assertion of this power during World War II, no president has used it since, is likely created inconvenience, but not havoc. Of course, we live in a different universe today. Although interpreting a 1942 law to cover the internet might seem far-fetched, some government officials recently endorsed this reading during debates about cybersecurity legislation. Under this interpretation, Section 706 could effectively function as a kill switch in the U.S., one that would be available to the president the moment he proclaimed a mere threat of war. It could also give the president power to assume control over U.S. internet traffic. I wonder if that would be less likely to be invoked by him because it would make it more difficult for Russia to control us. The potential impact of such a move can hardly be overstated. Ironically, that was probably the original intent, to make it less possible for Russia or someone else to control us. That was not supposed to be the goal of the President of the United States. And that's the underlying worry about all of this stuff. The potential impact of such a move can hardly be overstated. In August, in an early morning tweet, Trump lamented that search engines were, quote, rigged to serve up negative articles about him. Later that day, the administration said it was looking into regulating the big internet companies. I think that Google and Twitter and Facebook, they're really treading on very, very troubled territory, and they have to be careful, Trump warned. Should have read it in his voice. If the government were to take control of the U.S. internet infrastructure, Trump could accomplish directly what he threatened to do by regulation. Ensure that internet searches always return pro-Trump content as the top results. How about turning Google and Facebook directly over to the Russians? The government also would have the ability to impede domestic access to particular websites, including social media platforms. It could monitor emails or prevent them from reaching their destination. It could exert control over computer systems, such as states' voter databases, and physical devices such as Amazon's Echo speakers that are connected to the internet. To be sure, the fact that the internet in the United States is highly decentralized, a function of a relatively open market for communications devices and services, would offer some protection. Achieving the level of government control over internet content that exists in places such as China, Russia, and Iran would likely be impossible in the U.S. Moreover, if Trump were to attempt any degree of internet takeover, an explosion of lawsuits would follow. Not that he would necessarily care, but based on its First Amendment rulings in recent decades, the Supreme Court seems unlikely to permit heavy-handed government control over internet communication, though, as we know, 5 votes changes it all. But complacency would be a mistake. I think so don't be complacent. This is why I'm reading this article to you. Complete control of internet content would not be necessary for Trump's purposes. Even with less comprehensive interventions, he could do a great deal to disrupt political discourse and hinder effective, organized political opposition. And the Supreme Court's view of the First Amendment is not immutable. For much of the country's history, the court was willing to tolerate significant encroachments on free speech during wartime. The progress we have made is fragile. Jeffrey Stone, a constitutional law scholar at the University of Chicago, has written, I've run into him before, it would not take much to upset the current understanding of the First Amendment. Indeed, all it would take is Very well written here. I'll give you a thumbs up for this one. All it would take is 5 Supreme Court justices whose commitment to presidential power exceeds their commitment to individual liberties. Next up, sanctioning Americans. Next to war powers, economic powers might sound benign, but they are among the president's most potent legal weapons. All but 2 of the national emergency declarations in effect today were issued under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Passed in 1977, the law allows the president to declare a national emergency to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy that has its source in whole or in substantial part outside the United States. The president can then order a range of economic actions to address the threat, including freezing assets and blocking financial transactions in which any foreign nation or foreign national has an interest. In the late 1970s and 80s, presidents used the law primarily to impose sanctions against other nations, including Iran, Nicaragua, South Africa, Libya, and Panama. Then, in 1983, when Congress failed to renew a law authorizing the Commerce Department to control certain exports, President Ronald Reagan declared a national emergency in order to assume that control under IEEPA. Subsequent presidents followed his example, transferring export control from Congress to the White House. President Bill Clinton expanded IEEPA's usage by targeting not just foreign governments, but foreign political parties, terrorist organizations, and suspected narcotics traffickers. President George W. Bush took matters a giant step further after 9/11. His Executive Order 13224 prohibited transactions not just with any suspected foreign terrorists, but with any foreigner or any U.S. citizen suspected of providing them with support. Once a person is designated under the order, no American can legally give him a job, rent him an apartment, provide him with medical services, or even sell him a loaf of bread unless the government grants a license to allow the transaction. The Patriot Act gave the order more muscle, allowing the government to trigger these consequences merely by opening an investigation into whether a person or group should be designated. Yow, probably shouldn't have done that. Designations under Executive Order 13224 are opaque and extremely difficult to challenge. The government needs only a reasonable basis for believing that someone is involved with or supports terrorism in order to designate him. The target is generally given no advance notice and no hearing. He may request reconsideration and submit evidence on his behalf, but the government faces no deadline to respond. Moreover, the evidence against the target is typically classified, which means he's not allowed to see it. He can try to challenge the action in court, but his chances of success are minimal, as most judges defer to the government's assessment of its own evidence. Americans have occasionally been caught up in this Kafkaesque system. Several Muslim charities in the U.S. were designated or investigated based on the suspicion that their charitable contributions overseas benefited terrorists. Of course, if the government can show through judicial proceedings that it observed due process and other constitutional rights that an American group or person is funding terrorist activity, it should be able to cut off those funds. But the government shut these charities down by freezing their assets without ever having to prove its charges in court. In other cases, Americans were significantly harmed by designations that later proved to be mistaken. For instance, 2 months after 9/11, the Treasury Department designated Garad Jama, a Somalian-born American, based on an erroneous determination that his money-wiring business was part of a terror financing network. Jama's office was shut down and his bank account frozen. News outlets described him as a suspected terrorist. For months, Jama tried to gain a hearing with the government to establish his innocence, and in the meantime obtain the government's position to get a job and pay his lawyer. Only after he filed a lawsuit did the government allow him to work as a grocery store cashier to pay his living expenses. It was several more months before the government reversed his designation and unfroze his assets. By then, he had lost his business, and the stigma of having been publicly labeled a terrorist supporter continued to follow him and his family. Despite those dramatic examples, IEEPA's limits have yet to be fully tested. After 2 courts ruled that the government's actions against American charities were unconstitutional, Barack Obama's administration chose not to appeal the decisions and largely refrained from further controversial designations of American organizations and citizens. Thus far, President Trump has followed the same approach. He doesn't know about it. Don't tell him. That could change if you tell him. In October, in the lead-up to the midterm elections, Trump characterized the caravan of Central American migrants headed toward the U.S. border to seek asylum as a national emergency. Although he did not issue an emergency proclamation, he could do so under IEEPA. He could determine that any American inside the U.S. who offers material support to the asylum seekers, or for that matter to undocumented immigrants inside the United States, poses, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat, unquote, to national security, and authorize the Treasury Department to take action against them. Such a move would carry echoes of a law passed recently in Hungary, remember to keep an eye on Hungary, that criminalized the provision of financial or legal services to undocumented migrants. This has been dubbed the Stop Soros Law, after the Hungarian-American philanthropist George Soros, they're even angry at him there, still, who funds migrants' rights organizations. Although an order issued under IEEPA would not land targets in jail, it could be implemented without legislation and without affording targets a trial. In practice, identifying every American who has hired, housed, or provided paid legal representation to an asylum seeker or undocumented immigrant would be impossible, but all Trump would need to do to achieve the desired political effect would be to make high-profile examples of a few. Individuals targeted by the order could lose their jobs and find their bank accounts frozen and their health insurance canceled. The battle in the courts would then pick up exactly where it left off during the Obama administration, but with a newly reconstituted Supreme Court making the final call. Next section, boots on Main Street. The idea of tanks rolling through the streets of U.S. cities seems fundamentally inconsistent with the country's notions of democracy and freedom, although Trump wanted to do it in Washington, D.C., the worst possible place. Americans might be surprised, therefore, to learn just how readily the president can deploy troops inside the country. Everyone thinks he can't. The principle that the military should not act as a domestic police force, known as posse comitatus, has deep roots in the nation's history, and it is often mistaken for a constitutional rule. The Constitution, however, does not prohibit military participation in police activity, nor does the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 outlaw such participation. It merely states that any authority to use the military for law enforcement purposes must derive from the Constitution or from a statute. The Insurrection Act of 1807 provides the necessary authority. As amended over the years, it allows the president to deploy troops upon the request of a state's governor or legislature to help put down an insurrection within that state. It also allows the president to deploy troops unilaterally, either because he determines that rebellious activity has made it impracticable to enforce federal law through regular means, which he said as much, or because he deems it necessary to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy, terms not defined in the statute, that hinders the rights of a class of people or impedes the course of justice. Presidents have wielded the Insurrection Act under a range of circumstances. Dwight Eisenhower used it in 1957 when he sent troops to Little Rock to enforce school desegregation. George H.W. Bush employed it in 1992 to help stop the riots that erupted in Los Angeles after the verdict in the Rodney King case. George W. Bush considered invoking it to help restore public order after Hurricane Katrina, but opted against it when the governor of Louisiana resisted federal control over the state's National Guard. While controversy surrounded all of these examples, none suggests obvious overreach. And yet, the potential misuses of the act are legion. When Chicago experienced a spike in homicides in 2017, Trump tweeted that the city must fix the horrible carnage or he would send in the feds. To carry out this threat, the president could declare a particular street gang, say MS-13, to be an unlawful combination, and then send troops to the nation's cities to police the streets. He could characterize sanctuary cities, cities that refuse to provide assistance to immigration enforcement officials, as conspiracies against federal authorities, and order the military to enforce immigration laws in those places. Conjuring the specter of liberal mobs, he could send troops to suppress alleged rioting at the fringes of anti-Trump protests. How far could the president go in using the military within U.S. borders? The Supreme Court has given us no clear answer to this question. Take Ex parte Milligan, a famous ruling from 1866 invalidating the use of a military commission to try a civilian during the Civil War. This case is widely considered a high watermark for judicial constraint on executive action. Yet even as the court held that the president could not use war or emergency as a reason to bypass civilian courts, it noted that martial law, the displacement of civilian authority by the military, would be appropriate in some cases. If civilian courts were closed as a result of foreign invasion or civil war, for example, martial law could exist until the laws can have their free course.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, imagine that. And as they conclude this paragraph anyway, the message is decidedly mixed. Claims of emergency or necessity cannot legitimize martial law until they can. Where have you heard that formulation before? Anyway, time for us to sign off for the week. We'll be back, we hope, we think, next week. Stay tuned.